Okay, with the Eibishter's help, today's daf is Masechta Basra Daf Pei Vov, and we are starting from 3 lines from the bottom of Pei Hey Amid Beis. What we are discussing over here is a very simple question. You know that to make an acquisition, you need to do a kinyan. In other words, in order for something to be called yours, even if you're purchasing, even if you wired the money to somebody, that doesn't mean the item is yours. You have to make a kinyan. Kinyan Mishticha, Hagba, we learned all that. What happens? You have a basket, okay? And you put it down in the seller's property, and you're buying fruits, let's say. You have your own little basket, and you put it down in the seller's property. And the seller puts fruit into your basket. Did you acquire the fruits or not? And the question is, it's your basket, and your basket, if you were holding your basket, let's say, if it was on your head, let's say, you put the basket on your head, so your basket is koina because it's like your backyard. It's your chotzer. It's something that is a property that belongs to you. However, when the basket is resting on the property of the seller, perhaps the seller, it's not melted into the property of the seller. Perhaps it's melted into the property of the seller, and we ignore your basket. Your basket is as if it's non-existent, and you never left the domain of the seller. And or perhaps not. Perhaps your basket has its own domain, even though it's in the property of the seller. And let's read the question again. Boy minei Rav Sheshes Rav Huna. Rav Sheshes asked this question from Huna. Kelev shelakeach. Let's say the basket of the purchaser, and he put it down b'rshus moicher, and he put it down on the floor, on the domain, on the property of the seller. And the question is, the seller is putting fruits into that basket. Is the purchaser koina lekeach? Does the purchaser own the fruits? Oiloi. Now, of course, there's a big difference, because what happens if something happens to the fruit? If something happens to those fruits, then if it's the domain of the purchaser, then he lost out. If it's still in the domain of the seller, then the seller loses out. So the Gemara doesn't know how to deal with this question, and the Gemara is trying to bring proofs either way. Amar Rava. Rava said, Hashma coming here from a brisa. Moshach chamarav payalav. Let's say a person did like a bad meshicha. A chamor. Let's say a guy who has on his wagon fruits, and the purchaser pulled the donkey, which is pulling the wagon, into his property. Or payalav. Let's say the seller had his workers holding on to the fruits, and they were holding on to the fruits in a basket, right? And so the purchaser pulled the workers into his property. And he brought the workers or the wagon that was carrying the fruits of the seller into his house. So that's not a kinyan. Why? Because it was never put down into the domain of the purchaser. It's still on the wagon. It's still on the employee of the seller. So it doesn't matter, Bain Posak Achloi Modad, whether they made up a price, whether they agreed upon a price, even though he didn't measure out the fruits that let's say that he agreed he's buying 100 pounds of fruit. But even if they made up the price, but the guy did not give him the 100 pounds of fruit, he didn't, set it up, or Bain Modad Achloi Posak, or whether he gave 100 pounds of fruit, but they didn't make up the price, Shneim Yochoil. They both, the seller and the purchaser, can retract. It means there's no sale over here. Simply put, if you just pull somebody, he pulled the wagon into his house, the fruits are still on the wagon. It's not in his. It's in a separate domain, and therefore it's not on the floor of his property. So he didn't acquire those fruits. But now we go to Amid Aleph, Peivav Amalf, Pirkon. But let's say you unloaded the fruits. Let's say the fruits are in a basket on the wagon. Okay, so you unloaded the fruits, and you put it on the floor. Then you put it into your house. Oh, now who owns this basket? The seller owns the basket. It's the seller's basket. It was the seller's wagon. Presumably on his wagons, there's fruits. In bags, and he owns in baskets, and he owns those baskets. So then Posak achlei modad, if they made a price, even though the seller didn't actually count out the fruits, let's say he put down a basket of 150 pounds of fruits and the purchaser only wanted to buy 100 pounds of fruit, but they made up a price. But now the basket of the seller is in the domain of the purchaser. Oh, okay. So then who owns the fruits? Who owns the fruits? They cannot, the both of them cannot retract. So again, very clearly on Daf Pei Vav Aleph. Here we go. The seller brought fruit to the purchaser, and the Brisa says the purchaser unloaded the fruit in the seller's basket and put it down on the floor, and so therefore now automatically the purchaser fruits, even though it's in the basket of the seller. Now we don't say that the basket of the seller. We see from here that the basket of the seller is not a separate domain. It becomes part of the domain of the purchaser. We ignore the basket, right? So the Gemara is going to try to say the reverse should also be true. Listen to the reverse. If you have the purchaser's basket in the domain of the seller, so we will ignore the purchaser's basket, and it will always remain in the domain of the seller. And that is a clear that it doesn't work. Kelev shelekeach b'rshus moicha does not work. Just like the other way around, it does work. So because the kelev of the moicher in the rshus lekeach, it works. Because we always look at not the basket, but who owns the property where the basket is lying. If the purchaser owns the property where the basket is lying, even if the basket belongs to the seller, we ignore the basket. And the fruits now belong to the purchaser. And the seller hold in the reverse, just the opposite. If the basket belongs to the purchaser, but it's in the domain of the seller, so if it's in the domain of the seller, we will ignore the purchaser's basket, and the items still remain in the domain of the seller. So that will prove the answer to your question. So Shnei Menichab Umid the Kalov, since you just learned the Moicher B'Shus Lekeach Lekana, since the seller's basket in the domain of the purchaser Loikana, it means it never it doesn't belong to the seller anymore. Since it's in the Rishus Lekeach, it belongs to the purchaser. Even though the Kalev, the basket, belongs to the seller, we're going to say the reverse always is true as well. Kalev de Lekeach, even if the basket belongs to the purchaser, but it's B'Rishus Moicher, it's in the domain of the seller, it did not transfer ownership. Loikana, it did not transfer ownership. So we see an answer to your question. The question was, if Kalev of the basket of the purchaser in the domain of the seller, can that be effectuate a kinyan? The answer is no. That's what the Gemara is coming to this conclusion. Amar Rav Nachman by Yitzchak, Rav Nachman said, no raya from that brisa, because that brisa means pirkam. When you unloaded the fruits, it didn't mean that you left it in the seller's basket. Bishashafchen, you spilled it onto the floor of the purchaser's house. So once it's on the floor, there's no basket there. So there the purchaser acquires it. Ikbid Rava, who brought this rice as a proof, was upset that Rav Nachman tried to refute his answer. Because midi shafkan katani, pirkan to katani. Does the Brisa say the word he spilled it onto the floor? Pirkan, he unloaded it from the wagon. When the seller has a wagon full of fruits and it's in individual baskets, so basically what the purchaser does, he takes the basket with the belonging to the seller and puts it down on his property. That's what pirka means, unloaded. Shavchan is another word where you take the fruits and put it on the floor in your house. So that's why Rav did not like Rav Nachman by Yitzchak's answer. And Ella Omar Rav Rashi still says it's not a proof. Because pirka means you unloaded, but you could unload fruits that don't belong in a basket. Which fruits are sold without a basket? It's like garlic or something like that. So there's certain vegetables that are never put into a basket, and that's what it's talking about. These type of fruits, if this purchaser put it on the floor, that's why the purchaser acquired that vegetable or fruit, whatever it is, because we're not dealing here with a basket belonging to the seller. It's not part of the equation over here. Amale Huna Bray de Marzitra Ravina. Huna, the son of Marzutta, said to Ravine, another question. The question is, the Brisa said that the key to all this is that a price has to be made up. Even if you made the kinyan and effectuated a kinyan, if the purchaser doesn't know how much he's paying and the seller doesn't know exactly how much he's selling for, they didn't make up a price, then no kinyan happens. Even if I meet a purchaser and he says he wants to buy my fruits and vegetables, and we agree, and he makes a kinyan on my fruits and vegetables, the problem is that if we didn't make up a price, the kinyan doesn't work. Now the question is, why not? That's the question. Michte, pirkan ketani. If you unloaded it and put it into your property, the purchaser should acquire it. Mali posek or mali loy posek. Why does the price make a difference whether the price was made up beforehand or they didn't make up a price beforehand? So what's the difference? Once the purchaser made a kinyan, so that's it. Amalei. So Ravina answered, Posek Sam Chadaite. When they made up a price, the purchaser wants to buy it, and the seller wants to sell it. The purchaser wants to buy it because he's always afraid to commit because maybe he's going to pay too much. When somebody gives you the bill after you didn't even think about what it's going to cost, so you never really confirmed into commitment to purchase, and the seller doesn't know how much he's going to be able to sell. Maybe he's going to back out until he makes up a price. He's not certain that he wants to sell. So pasuk, if they make up a price, the purchaser and the buyer both rely and are confirmed. Loy pasuk, but if they didn't make a price, loy samchadaite, they did not confirm the purchase. One more point on this. Amalei Ravina Ravashi. Ravina said to Ravashi, Tashma, the Rav and Shmuel, the Amri Tavayu, Rav and Shmuel both say, Kalev shel Adam. Here's the proof. Kalev, let's say my basket of a purchaser, will effectuate a kinyan no matter where it is, even if you put the basket in on the floor of the seller's property. It seems to work. Rav Shmuel just said that clearly. La tuyamai, what are they trying to tell you? What novelty are they trying to tell you? Lav la tuye rishus moicha, that if it's in the domain of the seller, it's going to work. It's going to effectuate a kinyan. So Ravashi said that's not a proof. Hasam the amalei zilkni. Yes. Very interesting thing, if the seller says, okay, to the purchaser, you can acquire. So basically, even if the purchaser's basket is on the floor of the seller's property, since the seller said, I want you to acquire it, it's basically like the seller saying, I'm gifting you the property underneath your basket. So you really own the property underneath your basket. So that's your property. It's not that your basket is on my property. It's the seller's property. What we're talking about over here, a normal case where a seller and a buyer are at arm's length, and the seller just put his basket down on the floor without asking permission. He put his basket on the floor of the purchaser put his basket on the floor of the seller's property, and the seller started to unload the fruit into the basket of the purchaser. No thought was given to it. The question is, can the purchaser, the fact that the fruits are being dumped into his basket, is that enough to make an kinyan, even though he doesn't own the land underneath where the basket is? And this question remained unresolved. Let's go to a new story. Tanan Hasa, we learned over here, property, which is real estate, which lasts forever. That's the expression yesh lemachrayis. You could put a lien on property. So how do you acquire real estate? Niknim bekesef, if you transfer money, uvishtar, or you write a simple document. Even though you transfer money, the document itself can transfer ownership. Or the purchaser did something to show ownership, like he fixed a fence, he put up a wall, or something like that. Let's say you want to buy a piece of furniture, a movable item. So if you want to buy an armoire or something like that, a heavy piece of furniture, you need to drag it out of the house of the seller into your own private property. So Besura Master in Surah, the following teaching was named in the name of Rab Chizda. There's a new teaching. In Pumbedisa, another yeshiva, Master Lo Mishmeid Rav Kahana. Rav Kahana said this new chiddush. What chiddush? V'amri Lo Mishmeid Rav. And some said Rava said this chiddush. What is the novelty? A movable item, you could only use Mashicha is because it will work. You could use Mashicha. Mashicha is like schlepping an item on a floor, right? Schlepping an item on a floor is not a good way to kind of something. It's not a good way you're just schlepping it on the floor to your property. So loy shani, we didn't learn that Mashicha works. Elav devar she'ein darken lahagbia. If it's something that you can't lift up, like a heavy desk. But let's say you're buying something that you could easily pick up, like a book. You're buying something that could easily be picked up. Only with hagbah, with lifting it will work. With dragging it, it will not work. That's what the Gemara said. So if you want to buy let's say a book is something you could lift up, right? So you can't coin it by just dragging it on the floor to your property. So that's what the Gemara says. We don't give you that right of Mashiach. Says the Gemara, Esvei, Rav Ada bar Masna Abaya. So Rav Ada Masna asked to Abaya. We learned in a Brayso, I think it's a Mishnah. A goyniv kiss b'Shabbos, someone steals a little wallet on Shabbos, okay? Now, the halacha is that if you get the death penalty, or you potentially could get the death penalty on Shabbos, you don't have to pay for the item. So a guy goes into somebody's house, steals somebody's wallet, and then carries it out into the Rosh Hashanah. Chayev, he will still be chayev for the stealing of the wallet, even though he's potentially going to get killed for violating the Shabbos. He was already he got the Isser of Geneva stealing before he did the Isser of Shabbos. It didn't come at the same time because he first lifted the wallet, so he stole it, and then he brought it outside. But hoyo megarer v'yoytze. Let's say he didn't pull the wallet, he didn't lift the wallet. He just dragged the wallet on the floor outside into, let's say, the side of a Rosh Hashanah. Not necessarily Rosh Hashanah, but Mashiach could work in the Simta. So then, but still, you'll be chayev Issa Shabbos. Potter. So therefore, you're potter for paying for the wallet, because they're going to kill you anyway. The violation of Shabbos and the violation of stealing come at the same time. So once you're obligated, you have a penalty of two punishments. One is the death penalty, and one is paying for an item. Or you don't have to pay. You don't have to pay for stealing the wallet. That's what the Gemara said. The question is how varekis the bar hagbah.
Okay, how do you feel?
Kiss is this wallet is something that could easily be lifted up, right? A wallet is an easy thing. But the Brisa says, the Mishnah says you could acquire that wallet by just dragging it along the floor. So how could you say Mashiach will not work on something a lightweight item? Answers the Gemara, Amalei. So the Baya answered, B'misna, we're talking about a wallet that had a string attached to it. So the Gemara says just because it has a string attached to it, I know now we're talking about, so what? That's the point. Of course, every wallet should have a string attached to it, because that's the wallet they're talking about in the Mishnah, that you're dragging it on the floor. How you are dragging it, it must have a string attached to it. So Abai explained, I want it's a type of wallet that it's hard to imagine. It's a type of wallet so heavy, so heavy that you can't. It's made up of kryptonite or whatever. You can't lift it, and therefore you have the only way to acquire such a wallet is pulling it on the floor. That's what that Mishnah is talking about. Tashma, we learned in our Mishnah, if an item that's in the domain of the seller, loy kona achig be'enu, you're not acquiring the item until you lift it up. Until you drag it from his domain. That's what the Brisa says. So if it's the same item that you could either lift it up or drag it out, so you're not acquiring, it says the Mishnah, until you do either one, either lift it or drag it out. So we see that something that potentially could be lifted, you could use Mashiach. Alma, so we see from our Mishnah, midi de bar hagbah, something that's potentially that could be lifted, like a book. You have a choice. You could use the hagbah kinyan. You could use the dragging way to acquire it. So that's against what they learned in Surah and Pampadisa, that something that is darken lahagbiyah, if something you could lift it up, it's easy to lift up, then Mashiach will not work. And our Mishnah says Mashiach would work. Amar Rav Nachman Yitzchak, Rav Nachman Yitzchak says, you're reading our Mishnah wrong. Let's start in Ketani. Our Mishnah is giving you two samples. Midi the bar hakba, something that is liftable, and it's in the domain of the seller. Bahakba, you could only acquire it through lifting. Midi the bar b'shicha, something that could only be dragged. It's too heavy, but Mashicha, you have to use, you're allowed to use Mashicha. Maybe you could use Akba if you're superpower, but Mashicha certainly could, it works. We go to Amid Beis. Toshma, come in here. Hamoicha Peres Lachaver, someone sells fruits to his friend. Mashach v'le Modat Koni. He sells a little bit of fruits. Let's say like 5 fruits to his friend. The Mishnah says that if you did Mashicha, even though you didn't count out the fruits, right? You acquired it. Let's say the fruits are in a little bag, okay? So you pulled the bag with the fruits. You don't know how many fruits are in the bag, but you made up, you're paying $1 per fruit, per apple. So then, once you did Mashicha, you coin it. So we see, well, Paris, the B'nei Hagboninu. Paris, fruits are something that can be lifted, like apples can be lifted. Uktani, and the Mishnah says, the Kani Mashicha, you acquire it by dragging. So we see Mashiach works even on something that's liftable. And says the Gemara, and this we're talking about B'shlifi Rabbi. It's something that's like a lot of fruit. It's like a crate full of fruit, and therefore it's not liftable. That's why the Mashiach could work. If we're talking about unliftable items, a Maseifa, then what? How do you explain the second part of the Mishnah? Someone buys flax from his friend. There, the Mishnah says, you have to lift it up and lift it from one place to another place. The Mishnah says you could only do Hadba, but maybe why you could only do Hadba on Pishtan? Maybe the flax is in a big pile, a big crate, and you're allowed to do Mashicha. Why does the Mishnah say flax is only Hadba? When you're buying flax, you can only do Hadba. How do you know? Maybe Mashicha would work by flax. And says the Gemara, no. Shani Pishtim Dimshtamet. Flax is slippery, and generally, people sell them in small bundles, which are liftable. So flax generally is something that you could only do Hagba. You can't do Mashicha because flax is a liftable item, and you never sell it in like huge crates. But regular apples, where it's sold in huge crates, which are non-liftable, then Mashicha will work. Amalei Ravina Ravashi. Ravina said to Ravashi, Tashma, come in here. Behema Gasa, you're buying a large animal, Niknas B'Masira. Let's say you're buying a horse, so then you just hold on to the reins. That's how you acquire it. Bahadaka, but if you're buying a little animal, like a sheep, a baby sheep, Bahadba, you have to lift it up. Divrei Meir. Rav Shimon and Elazar, Divrei Meir, Rav Shimon and Elazar. These Rav Meir and Shimon Elazar are the same person, they hold the same opinion. Chachamim say, you don't have to lift up a small animal, a small animal like a sheep, you can actually drag the animal to your property. So you see that at a liftable item, you could use Mashicha. So that's clearly against what Rava and Surah and Pampadisa all said. And says, a small animal like a sheep, the bar hakbahi, it's something that you could lift up, and its price says you could acquire it by dragging it. And says the Gemara, even though I potentially could lift a little sheep, but go to a little zoo and with your kids, and you'll see it's not so easy. Shani behema, a little animal, the sarcha, it tries to hold on to the ground. It doesn't allow you to lift it up. It makes it all very uncomfortable. They don't like to be held that way. And therefore, by behema data, it's not like buying a book, which you could easily lift up. There, Mashiach will not work. But a little animal, the animal resists being lifted up, and therefore Mashiach could work even by a little animal. Let's do one little piece of the Gemara over here, and then we'll stop. Rav Shmuel Damrei Tavaya, new piece. Rav and Shmuel both say, Kur, if a man said, I'm selling you 30 pounds, let's call Kur 30 pounds of wheat. Bishloishim, I'm selling it you for $30. So $1 per pound, ani moichalach. So let's say the seller is going 1, 2, here's a pound, 2, but even by the 29th pound, as long as he didn't fill the basket he transferred 30 pounds, then the seller could retract because he sells, I'm selling you 30 pounds, a kur. So therefore, until he transfers over 30 pounds, he could always retract from the sale. But what happens? He says, Kur b'shleishim, I'm selling you 30 pounds for $30, right? $1. But then he said, Saw basela, each pound is for a dollar. So he labeled it out that he's each pound he's selling for a single unit. So rishon kana. So even if each time he counts out a pound, the purchaser acquires it. So if he puts a pound into the purchaser's domain, so even though he didn't give the full 30 yet, so once it lands in the purchaser's domain, the seller cannot retract from the sale because he said, I'm selling you a pound per seller. Toshma, but we ask a question, one question. If the Mishnah, our Mishnah said, let's say the measuring item, let's say the basket belonged to the purchaser. So Rishon Kana, as soon as it lands into the purchaser's basket, he acquires it. Even though the seller didn't finish counting it out, as soon as anything enters the basket of the seller, it belongs to the purchaser. It belongs to the purchaser. Now here he didn't say, "I'm selling you each pound for $1." And we see automatically it works. As soon as it enters the domain of the purchaser acquires it. Answers the Gemara, no, you can have to read our Mishnah that in the same manner. Going to Amalei, he said to him, Hin b'shneim osar sloim. I'm selling you a hin, which is like a liquid measurement, for $12, right? For 12 sloim. Lug, each lug, which is this hin has 12 lugs, right? So each lug has besela. He said it, he labeled it out that each lug I'm selling you for $1. And how do you know? How do you measure liquid? That in the Beis Hamikdash they had ridges that looks like this. When they wanted to measure, let's say, oil for the nesachim, like wine or something for the nesachim, they had ridges that marked out where you're supposed to pour the wine. So same thing over here. They had ridges, so he knew exactly as soon as he put in one hin that he already gave over one hin, even though his intention, the seller, was to sell more. But as soon as he marked off one, the purchaser already acquired it, and the seller can no more retract. Okay, we will stop over here.